Okay. Last plea that if you're coming in, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, who you are, what your connection to the topic is, and what you're hoping to learn from today. And I'm going to start to get us started. And just one more note for the chat that we'll have people from across the transportation and infrastructure and conservation sectors. So we're bringing together these communities and hoping to sort of break down the barriers that separate them. So feel free to connect with each other and share some experiences or share some of your technical interests in the topic, and we can start facilitating those conversations. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Daniel Harnett. I'm a senior program officer on the WWF Sustainable Infrastructure team based out of Washington, D.C., and I'll be facilitating the conversation today. This webinar is hosted by the Community of Practice on Nature and Infrastructure, which we call CoPNI. And it is what it sounds like. It's a community that's built around the intersection of infrastructure development and conservation to bring these communities together to solve the challenges that are posed when these things interact, when infrastructure is built in nature, and they're so intertwined. CoPNI was created in a direct response to the Convention on Biological Diversity's decision to mainstream biodiversity throughout sectors, which includes the infrastructure sector. And one of the mechanisms that they identified to do so is the facilitation of sector-specific communities of practice, such as this one by CoPNI. CoPNI is organized by WWF and the Nature Conservancy. And we're calling this series CoPNI Conversations because they're designed to move information in both directions between us and our community and help to spur these conversations. We did some really excellent consultations. It was great to talk with people, stakeholders throughout the sector about what is needed. And it seems like conversation and an actual dialogue and flow of information is really one of those key things. So I'm going to say this throughout the conversation today. Please get involved, speak up, ask questions in the chat, make comments. We're going to have a pretty substantial discussion period at the end. So we're looking forward to you getting involved here. We have some really great expert speakers that we're going to start with, but then we're looking for input from the community, all the way from practitioners up through policymakers and then everyone in between who touches on infrastructure or nature at any of these decision points. The CoPNI program and this conversation series are supported by the Greening Transportation Infrastructure Development Integrated Program, which is funded by the Global Environment Facility, led by WWF in coordination with UNEP and the Asian Development Bank. It's a 6-year program that we're just starting year 2 of, aimed at integrating biodiversity into infrastructure planning and delivery and every step in between. And we're operating at a global level and implementing in partner countries in Suriname, Malaysia, Nepal, Philippines, and Ukraine. And now to quickly talk on the topic of why we're here, it's around these two things: transport infrastructure, the roads, railways, ports that people and goods move on across ecosystems or landscapes, and then biodiversity, where these things are located. They're so interconnected when they land on the ground. Wildlife movement wants to often go this way, and transport often wants to go this way, where people want to move. And at that intersection, you can find things like ecosystem fragmentation and vehicle-wildlife conflict or crashes. And then you start to see how infrastructure and communities rely on the resilience that nature and nature-based solutions can provide to us. But they're treated as separate issues in a lot of the SDGs and most planning frameworks that we deal with today. And the SDGs, which is a little teaser to our conversation later, is a global set of 17 goals that were adopted in 2015 by the United Nations as the 2030 Agenda. We are approaching 2030 now, and so conversations are embarking on how we can accelerate progress towards these goals in the last few years, and then what happens in this post-2030 world, and what are the frameworks that we're embedded within afterwards. So I'll talk about just a couple of the SDGs this morning, specifically SDG 9 on infrastructure, innovation, industry, which on the topic of transport largely looks at increasing access and volume of movement on transportation, highways and railways. And then SDGs 14 and 15 are the biodiversity goals. There's life underwater and life on land, and they call for protection and restoration of ecosystems and spatial areas for the life within those ecosystems. But there isn't a mechanism that requires a bank or a country or a project to reconcile these two and make sure that we're reporting on both sets of goals. So there can be situations where the priorities don't align and that we might be setting back towards one goal while progressing towards another. And we know that there are opportunities to engage at this nexus at every stage of the infrastructure development process, from planning and policy making through financing and design, procurement, into construction and operations, all the way through decommissioning an asset and what happens with infrastructure towards the end of its life. So this conversation is happening now as we're entering the final years of the 2030 agenda to accelerate these goals, but also as we're starting this conversation around the post-2030 agenda. And more specifically, even this year, the UN has just started the UN Decade on Sustainable Transport, which I think Carly will speak to a little bit more later. But generally, it aims to steer global efforts towards sustainable, inclusive, and resilient transportation systems. And nature has a role to play in all of those elements, especially sustainable and resilient systems, which will probably come up today. So a little bit more context setting. 2 weeks ago, WWF, SLOCAT, and IRF co-hosted a side event at the UN High-Level Political Forum in New York on this topic. We had speakers from the transport, engineering, conservation, finance, and policy sectors, and together we produced a set of draft recommendations towards these two things: how to accelerate progress towards 2030 and what happens in the frameworks that come post-2030. So we'll share those draft recommendations later today. But first, we want to go into the conversation, talk about this a little bit more, and then hear what your thoughts are on what needs to happen. So we have some great speakers that I'll quickly introduce. Elena Kishenko is the head of strategic influence at WWF International and leads WWF's network-wide post-2030 agenda process. And then we'll have Carly Gilbert-Patrick, who is the Secretary General of SLOCAT. She'll speak about a global goal for transport and the consultation process that is happening. And then we have Alice Yu from the International Road Federation, who's the head of advocacy and outreach. We'll talk more about what road agencies are doing and how this lands on the ground. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, both all the presentations from our speakers and the conversation with everybody who has attended. And so I will delay no longer and pass it over to you, Elena. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you so much for the very good introduction to this topic. And I think the title of a conversation is probably the most appropriate here, particularly when it relates to the post-2030 agenda, as I think we all understand the current situation in the world, the discussions that are happening on any multilateral engagements. And so there are no easy solutions or easy silver bullet moments here to really jump to. It is a genuine conversation that I think is the right time to have, and I'm very grateful to be here and very excited to see a very, very good audience. And thank you so much for introducing yourselves in the chat. I would love to connect all of you. It's a real pleasure to be here. So as Daniel mentioned, I work at WWF's Global Policy Impact Team, and I work on a range of multilateral processes, but one of them is specifically the post-2030 agenda. And from the very early work that we're doing on this and early discussions with many, many stakeholders, it does look like a not very straightforward topic to work on. And what I will share today, before then my colleagues jump into more infrastructure-related specifics of that discussion, I want to paint maybe a broader picture of where we are, some of the learnings from Sustainable Development Goals process, some of the principles that we're starting to take on board for the post-2030 agenda, where principles are probably now in a way more important than the technical details, which of course will come with the process itself. So first, just situate us a little bit in where we are and maybe what we're seeing as the key gaps that we need to close when we look at the 2030 and post-2030 agenda from conservation perspective. Of course, I'm talking on behalf of the conservation constituency as a representative of WWF. I think we all appreciate that when Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, they represented a really bold vision, and we should not forget about the importance and the achievement of that vision in recognizing that human well-being and economic prosperity and environmental sustainability are deeply interconnected. At the same time, while appreciating the progress that was made with the even notion of Sustainable Development Goals being in place, we also, through all of the multiple reports the official reports, the various complementing reports on sustainable development goals, we're seeing, of course, that we're lagging behind in delivering on many of them, but with nature in particular, with those nature-specific goals that Daniel has mentioned, we're lagging more than with any others. And it seems not accidental. We're seeing that, of course, through the multilateral processes that are specifically focused on biodiversity and climate, and we're seeing that, of course, translating through the lack of progress on those as well. So it's really understood that we are very far behind on nature-related goals and climate-related goals versus what the world has committed to do. We see as one of the key reasons for that in the fact that there is a siloed approach in how these goals have been set up and how nature has been treated overall. So despite the best aspirations and the best intentions in recognizing the interconnectedness of nature and development and economic prosperity and security, in reality, these goals are not integrated. And of course, when looking at the accountability, the delivery, the metrics, it's not surprising that then those are also treated as silos, and that leads in a way to the lack of understanding and recognition of the foundational role that nature plays in delivering across all of the goals. So that is a big gap that I think we learned that is not taking us where we need, and something that we really need to address going forward. The infrastructure and transport play, of course, a specific role there. So we know, of course, that when you lock something, when you look at particular infrastructure solutions and the finance that goes into that and the long-term nature of those solutions, it does dictate our future for many decades to come. So choosing in how we approach and integrate our decisions on infrastructure and transport and how we measure the success of those decisions will be incredibly important for the future of the sustainable development, but also specifically for how we set the post-2030 agenda. Now, in many ways, I also want to stay away from the discussion on what exactly that post-2030 framework should look like. Having had many conversations with diplomats, with our UN counterparts, with other civil society organizations, I think what is becoming clear is, of course, there's a dedicated process which will start from September next year from the SDG summit in New York, where that formal review will take place and that formal process will be launched. And so I want to leave those specific recommendations on how that new framework should look like to the process itself. But I also feel like that might not be the most important thing to look at this point. I think we all share the ambition behind the goals themselves, and as much as they can be improved across kind of different elements of them, technical elements, what we should really look into is why we have not been able to deliver on many of them and what is holding us back on a systemic level, which then should help us start working immediately across both the SDGs, but also the multilateral agreements dedicated to biodiversity, climate, and others, looking at the systemic shifts that need to happen. And this is where then we look at the implementation and the how and unlocking the barriers that are holding us back, more than maybe a bit more of an academic discussion on what specific metrics and goals should be in the post-2030 agenda. So I think the more we have those conversations, the more we understand that what we require is a clear understanding of certain fundamental principles in the process itself that should take us to a better outcome. Of course, we're talking about the integration in a larger sense, so looking across the different systems that are represented by the goals in the outcomes way, but looking at how maybe some of them should be looked from the systemic perspective, kind of going away slightly from infrastructure. Some of the key systems that really jump out in that sense, driving across development, economic security, sustainability, environment, are food, energy, and finance. So our food systems are one of the key largest drivers of biodiversity. The energy systems are, of course, again, cut across many of those elements. And then the finance is what determines how all of that is funded and how the world is using the financial instruments in making sure that the actual change happens and actual systemic shift happens. So one of our calls to action is to look from that perspective. So there is a pre-2030, there's a post-2030, but what action needs to happen on a systemic level from this point on, using some of the instruments such as biodiversity framework, but also other instruments in our disposal to really shift the dial and to really look at a much more integrated systemic approach to particularly the key systems driving biodiversity loss and development issues. Some of the other key principles that we really want to reiterate here is the whole society approach. So what is also clear is that these systemic shifts cannot be achieved through pure government action or solely policy introductions. We do need to have everyone on board and a much more collaborative approach with the industry, with the rights holders, with the civil society, with academia, to really look at the theory of change behind those systemic shifts and how they can be achieved, where everyone has to have a seat at the table. And that also feels slightly kind of fulfilled right now, and that a lot of there's a lot of siloed approach, not only in the goals themselves, but also in how they seem to be needed to be implemented. The accountability is another big gap where we feel that the accountability, of course, coming from the siloed approach in the goals and the metrics is not really fit for purpose at this point to really drive the change that we want to see. So those accountability mechanisms need to be introduced, and the accountability system need to be changed to really drive better outcomes. Again, this goes much more to how and what rather than the discussion of the goals of the metrics themselves, which I still understand that we'll have more from specifically on the infrastructure a bit later. And then kind of finishing my painting the picture and my short intervention, it is also becoming clear that the world of the consensus-based multilateral approach, where everyone is supposed to sign up for exactly the same thing and that drives action, is not necessarily always attainable at this moment. And so more and more work will be driven by the coalitions of the willing, by the coalitions of the acting, by those who want to focus on certain priorities that they deem important for them and drive that forward. And we're fully endorsing that approach. Now is the time to really, for people who want to take action, to take that action, find allies, and unite themselves around specific goals or specific measures that they feel are important for their prosperity and economic well-being. So just sort of finishing with the urgency of needing to have that discussion, while it seems that the post-2030 process isn't post-2030, in reality, we've got a year before the formal process will start, and we've got only 6 months before the declaration for the SDG summit will start to be developed. And I am 100% sure that in a couple of months, we'll see a flourish of activity, of new visions being brought together, new proposals on how the post-2030 agenda should look like. It's really important that we all start working towards that now and building a cohesive common understanding of what good looks like in this sense, particularly focusing on what's holding us back in implementation and how can we unlock that through systemic change. And so I encourage everyone in this room to really start engaging in this theme in the next few months, because those will be critical to shape that agenda. So with that, Daniel, I hand back over to you.
Thank you very much, Elena. That was a fantastic way to start. Lots to think about there. A couple of things that stood out to me is I love that you started with, well, like, we agree on the ambition that doesn't need to change, but how we get there and the processes involved really need to be evaluated. You also highlighted food systems and energy systems and finance systems, and something that makes the infrastructure sector, I think, unique is that all these other sectors often rely on the infrastructure sector, especially with regards to transport. So it's important to tie those together as well. Your notes on accountability and urgency, absolutely. And then I got chills when you mentioned the coalition of the willing and the acting, because I think that's the group that we're in today. And it's nice to have so many early adopters and champions for the cause on this call and taking this on so early. And so with that, maybe Carly will help lay out a process that helps answer all of these massive questions and solves everything. Over to you, Carly. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we are looking at the full PowerPoint view right now. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Really great to be here. I'm Carly Gilbert Patrick, the Secretary General for SLOCAT, which is the International Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport. And what we're really trying to do is be the glue of the global sustainable transport movement. We are bringing together our partners of over 100 organizations, which include everyone from UN agencies, WHO, UNEP, UN Habitat, WWF is a partner of SLOCAT, most of the multilateral development banks, NGOs. So we're trying to take all of those different priorities and asks and carry that as one voice into the rooms where the future of transport is decided. So we are starting a process on coordinating our partnership and the wider transport community and the wider Nexus community that crosses over with transport to have one global goal for transport with some supporting targets. We feel there's this huge systematic failure in transport, whether that be at the political level, the policy and the investment level, that's resulting in all the problems we see from the transport sector today. And at the same time, we know transport is an enabler of every other sector, but because of this fragmented governance and the transport community and all of the nexus sectors that surround transport, including biodiversity, we're not seeing the traction or the investment or the prioritization that we need. And there have been some very good attempts at sort of putting down targets, commitments, declarations, but they are all fragmented still. So you have declarations coming through the climate and the COP process, you have declarations coming through sustainable development, you have individual governments coming up with targets and commitments, but there's no holistic umbrella or united framework. So we see this 10-year window of the UN Decade for Sustainable Transport as an opportunity, and that's why the time is right now for a global goal, because it can support that decade by, if you like, giving it teeth and of assigning it clear targets that we can measure and track and report against and showcase. And that gives us ultimately accountability, and it can enable us to strengthen cooperation and hopefully guide and mobilize coordinated finance and investment. So the UN Decade of Sustainable Transport, for those who don't know, basically came out of a UN General Assembly resolution in 2023, where all of the governments, or the member states as the UN calls them, signed up and said basically from 2026 is going to be the UN Decade for Sustainable Transport. So this is a government commitment, and there's an implementation plan that sits underneath that. And, you know, it talks about habitat loss and fragmentation and ecosystem damage and nature, and transport being an enabler, but also a cause of these issues. So it's kind of hooked in there. And what we want to do is really make sure that this global goal has some sort of intrinsic and targeted link to what needs to be done as a solution to some of these problems. So at COP30 in 2025, there was a sort of beginning of a thinking around a global goal. And there was a sort of a framing that we need a process to start. It's not that we can just come up with a global goal and targets, but we should start the process on consulting with governments and other stakeholders on what that should be. And at the same time, at the same COP, there was an 11-country pledge to reduce energy demand from the transport sector by 25%, and also shift to 1/3 sustainable and renewable sources. So that already, as we were launching this idea that we need a global goal and targets, in a way, Chile sort of led to the front with these other 10 countries and said, we already have a commitment for a target. So there was a lot of momentum there. And then more recently, I've been with SLOCAT for 5 months as the Secretary General, taking over from Marusha, and our board of 13, which includes the likes of GIZ and Asian Development Bank and Kuna Climate Centre. So really sort of representing a cross sector of the transport community. Our board approved our 8 strategic pillars as SLOCAT, and the first pillar is all around developing and coordinating the process for this global goal, and with narrative and targets based on the fact that everything that we want to do following on from that, the global advocacy, our regional hubs, strengthening our partnership, we need this goal and these targets to really frame where our resources and efforts should go. There was also a workshop in February in Geneva, hosted by a number of organizations, including Climate Compatible Growth, World Resource Institute, ITDP, and it was all about how should we measure and track the UN decade. And what came out of this, again, was this recommendation that we need a global goal and targets, and there were some criteria that were put forward on how we would choose that. And then we've been having a lot of moments at the International Transport Forum Summit with ministers, in Athens at the UCI Bike City Forum, at the Asia Transport Forum in Manila, and more recently at the High Level Political Forum in New York, where we've really been discussing and trying to understand what the community needs from this global goal process. So the current thinking is basically that there needs to be some sort of big North Star vision-led forward-looking statement for transport. This is no easy task, but we're going to try and coordinate this process, and that it should be time-bound but not overly technical. And then underneath that would be a number of quantifiable, trackable, comparable targets. These are the criteria that I talked about that came out of the Geneva workshop. What was really clear is that we must frame this by the UN decade for sustainable transport. There's a very strong implementation plan. It's very narrative focused, but we feel like the goal and targets can complement that narrative, that it needs to be clear. We need to be able to communicate it. It needs to be politically feasible. It can't be so ambitious that governments are just like, we can't achieve any of this. We've got to have the data there that already exists. There's got to be policy and investment accountability. It's got to apply to the world. It's a global goal, but we think some of those targets that sit underneath it can sort of have regional contextualization. We do not want to create any new targets. The world has enough targets from transport, from biodiversity, from health, from tourism, you name it, there's a target. So what we're trying to do is work bottom up and turn it into a unified framework. So we're very early in the process, and we're just at the end of this month, we hope to share a methodology with the wider transport community, which covers some of this in a bit more detail. And we're moving into some targeted consultations. Like I mentioned, we had one in New York. We hope that around November time, we will soft launch recommended global goal and targets, because the best way to get people to rip something apart is if you show them something. So we don't think it will be the final goal and targets, but we share something. And then by the end of March next year, we'll have the sort of final goal and targets. And this needs commitment, predominantly from government, but also from the stakeholders that support governments, including NGOs, academia, research, private sector, etc. So we think if we get to where we want to be, then we have an established shared framework for action for transport and all the crossover sectors. And that means that governments and everyone else, we can all see ourselves on the same page in the same system, which is what we don't have. That can then strengthen the coordination and the alignment, and we can have accountability for the UN decade at the same time. And we want it to guide investment and development and climate finance. So then what does that mean really for biodiversity and ecosystems and nature? So this is basically my last slide, and this is sort of where we are at the moment. We know we need a global goal for transport. It's a bit like an executive summary. It will probably come once we've got the targets. We can then summarize it into what the global goal vision is. In New York, there was this kind of beginning of a conversation that what about if the high level target is we want to halve emissions from the transport sector and we want to triple access. So that could like half emissions and then some sub-level targets around energy use and electrification and clean fuels. And on the triple access side, it would be about safe, affordable, public and popular transport, walking, cycling, shared mobility, freight. This was a group of 12 people. So this was the beginning of looking at all of those existing targets and commitments and saying, what could this look like as a global goal and target? So it's very much the beginning, not the end of the process. But what's interesting about New York is if you look at half emissions and triple access, it really doesn't give you anything around nature or biodiversity or ecosystems. So for me, this conversation with you is about how do we make sure that once again, we don't ignore what transport is doing to nature and ecosystems and biodiversity, and instead we build it in. And what would that look like? And how do we end up with a set of targets that isn't 50 targets long because there's a target on nature and one on tourism and one on health and one on education and one on walking and cycling and freight, and you end up with 50 targets and everyone ignores the whole thing. So we're very early on in this process, and we will be working very closely with GRID and this community of practice and WWF to make sure that we have an in-depth consultation with this community to make sure something feeds in that's useful to you based on all the work that you've already done, and for example the recommendations from GRID that this session is about. So it's a beginning of a conversation, and we welcome everyone. If you know strongly this is what the target should be, then put it in the chat and we'll pop it in for the consultation. But my feeling is that we need a bit of a longer chat, and this conversation, this webinar is the beginning of that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Carly. It's so inspiring to see SLOCAT taking on the hard work of bringing this sector together to figure out this really complicated question of what does a global goal look like. But I think you painted the vision so nicely where you said that it's a future where we all the stakeholders involved see themselves as on the same page, part of the same system, and where all those priorities can be represented appropriately in what we're targeting or measuring. I love that vision. I think this is a great time to open up a survey to our participants about your vision. We're going to do a little bit of a forward, backwards look at when we're in, around this date of 2030, which is a sort of a transition into a new framework, but also the middle point of this decade on sustainable transport. When we look back from 2030, what will we hope we have achieved by that point? I think we have a survey that we can launch. There we go. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing what the audience is thinking as we head into the final presentation here and then our discussion. We'll leave this open for a couple of minutes. I'm just stalling as I see answers slowly starting to trickle in. But our next speaker will be Alice Yu with the International Road Federation. And I think we can leave this poll up for a couple minutes while I pass it over to you, Alice, because I want to make sure that we have time for our conversation at the end. So please get your thoughts into the poll, but don't take too long because Alice's presentation is going to be very interesting and telling at the sectoral level what the road sectors are doing. So over to you, Alice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel. I wanted to type in as well, so I was like trying to get some words in before sort of sharing my screen. I wanted to see if you're seeing my screen correctly.
Yes.
Are you seeing just the PowerPoint or okay.
Yes.
So you're seeing it now? Okay, good. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation for Daniel, WWF colleagues to engage the International Road Federation in this really important start of our conversations together. And also really, really grateful for Elena and Carly for your wonderful and very inspiring thoughts, very careful, very thoughtful explanation about the processes that we're trying to engage in, and also the opportunities that are around there and how we can potentially approach and provide very valuable impact to these processes. I'm going to come in from a slightly different angle, but hopefully very complementary. So please bear with me, okay? But a little bit introduction about the International Road Federation. So we're an independent and membership-based organization. We're headquartered in Geneva. We've been around since for nearly 80 years, okay? So we work as a trusted platform for the road sector, and we focus a lot on the infrastructure side of road transport. And we try to bring the industry leaders together and to create knowledge, to shape policies, and to build institutional capacity. And so Carly, just now, you already mentioned about the UN Decade of Sustainable Transport. Thank you so much. That would spare me a lot of time to explain it. And as an international organization representing just the road sector, we wanted to also see how we can potentially provide meaningful contribution to global processes from a sectoral point of view. So what the International Road Federation has come to do is that we're working with a global coalition of partners, including WWF. We have put forward a voluntary commitment in which we are developing a series of roadmaps to provide practical recommendations and guidelines, specifically for road agencies and authorities across 4 themes: inclusive roads, safe roads, green roads, and efficient roads. So it all speaks to different parts of road infrastructure and operations and management and maintenance. And just like what Carly says, the transport sector is really, really dynamic. There's so many impacts and so many different ways to look at it. And we try to just kind of capture it from the road sector's perspective. So today I would like to actually focus a bit on the nature dimension that falls under this green roads theme that we're developing with WWF and another organization called ORIS. And I wanted to start with explaining the main messages that we wanted to share with, again, our audience is the road agencies and authorities. We wanted to tell them that if they advance green roads, they're going to see nature as service to sustainability objectives. And I'm sure the biodiversity community would see it, the other way around, like how transport may potentially disrupt or, fragment ecosystem. But from a road professional's perspective, we want them to understand that nature is very, very valuable for achieving their objectives as industry leaders. And what we wanted to send as the main message is that nature positive design multiplies sustainability outcomes. So it's not a trade-off. We could see ecological functions and infrastructure performance really could be sharing the same system, so that the same intervention could deliver across biodiversity, for road resilience, for road safety, climate, and also cost at the same time. So if we reframe the narrative in this way, then every road investment could become an opportunity to restore and also conserve nature in the process, rather than being seen as a cost imposed on the road project. So on the left, you see here, what we're trying to give them as examples is that, from one measure, you could get many returns from your investment. So when we talk about wildlife crossings and connectivity measures, they can reduce habitat fragmentation and at the same time reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. So a biodiversity measure is at the same time a road safety measure, which could directly link to the road safety, UN Decade for Road Safety, and the wider Safe System agenda. And that nature-based solutions such as vegetated slopes and wetlands, they deliver ecological benefits and also infrastructure resilience at the same time. And you've then got the drainages. They're designed for natural water flows. They can maintain hydrology and also let wildlife move while cutting erosion and washout risks to the road. And there are the verges and vegetation management. They could balance driver visibility with carbon storage, water infiltration, filtration, and habitat connectivity. Our roadmap also wants to help agencies to see what it takes for roads to be nature positive by the end of the decade, which is 2035, which also speaks to the post 2030 agenda that we've been listening about. And that means going beyond doing less harm. So we're not only just looking at, oh, let's do less harm to nature. It's not just about avoiding or reducing the impacts across planning, across the design and the delivery or the management, but we're actively regenerating and restoring biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. So that speaks to the life cycle assessment that allows road agencies to weigh biodiversity impacts alongside carbon, in their design choices, or restoration measures alongside roads that turns into what would otherwise be simple erosion control into the ecosystem recovery using native vegetation. But this is also a very interesting case that we want to present to road agencies, and we want to spend more time about this message here, because this is really the part that could potentially change the mindset. Road agencies naturally may not arrive to the mindset of prioritizing biodiversity first very reasonably, because when they build a road, they really think about the traffic throughput, the passengers and the vehicles are going through. So we need to start with the money case. This is the language that a lot of engineers or project managers would act upon. So we want to focus about the cost of inaction. Wildlife vehicle collisions, we've heard just now, these are really direct and recurring costs to road authorities and road users. So there's a study that we often quote by this Western Transportation Institute. They look at a number of transport departments in the US, and they put the average cost of a single collision with wildlife. In 2020, it takes about $14,000 to recover from a collision with a deer, and it's $45K from a collision with elk. And if you hit a moose, good God, this is $83,000 of costs that we're counting, and that involves the vehicle repair, the injuries, and the fatalities. It doesn't even account for the indirect costs of the loss in time, the congestion and the loss in productivity, etc. So on any corridor with real wildlife presence, these numbers do stack up year after year. But then on the other side of this argument is that prevention pays, because collision costs have risen so rapidly because of the inflation and the economy, etc. The point at which the fencing and the wildlife crossings will pay for itself as roughly half since 2020. So back in 2020, it would take about 3.2 collisions per kilometer per year if you hit a deer, it will take 3.2 collisions to break even with the cost of your investments in fencings and wildlife crossings. But now today, it only takes 1.5 collisions to break even. So a very well-designed fence with crossings, it really cuts large mammal collision also by around 80%, which means that the choice isn't about spending on nature or saving money. Agencies that do not build prevention in are simply choosing to keep paying for these crashes. And then there's the same logic also emerging about materials, specifically with the case of permeable pavements, which lets water seeps through rather than, creating pools of water when there's a flood. They also are less prone to icing, which provides a safer surface in freezing conditions. Permeable pavements also avoid the heat island effect. It's also made of recycled materials, and it's generally cheaper to install and also cheaper to maintain. So when you kind of put all of these things on paper and you provide it to the agencies and authorities, then the case will become more persuasive, okay? And that's the fun thing about this roadmap, about this coalition that we're trying to build, is how do we help agencies to see what are the benefits coming from applying nature and biodiversity concerns across the project life cycle. And so part of this roadmap is also providing what works if we consider these nature and biodiversity considerations upstream at the planning and the decision phase, and not bolted on afterwards only if a collision keeps happening or only if like the local community gets really angry about certain things. So these are some of the specific, recommendations that we're providing before the project begins, during the design phase, the procurement and constructions, and the operation and maintenance steps that they're looking at. And so I think I might be running out of time. So I think what I would perhaps close with is the fact that there is actually a draft of this roadmap, and that we're opening it for peer review. And I'm seeing colleagues, when you introduce yourself in the chat box, I'm like, oh, all of you really need to look at this, because we need more experts and people that have worked on the ground to look at this drafts and to provide more experiences, more case studies, more data, more money evidence, just to help us build this case. And so, what my ask to today's community of practice is that, if you're interested and you have the time to review, we are opening it up to the 10th of August. Please write me an email. Happy to have a chat, have an interview with you, or you can provide written input to us. But I'm going to stop here for now, and I really look forward to today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alice. There's so much there to dig into and so many compelling points. One that really stood out to me that sort of captured it all is how you reference this as a multiplier. It speaks to all of the priorities from biodiversity, safety, resilience, climate, and costs, and using nature-based solutions or taking nature-positive approaches doesn't just solve the biodiversity or nature issue. It's relevant to all of these things that anyone who cares about roads or railways cares about too. So I thought that was really powerful. I'd like to open up to just a couple questions or comments from the room at this point. We've heard a lot of really great things from our speakers. There's so much happening around the world on this topic. So I want to take a couple minutes to answer some questions. If we have any from the room, feel free to put your hand up or put them in the chat. If you have a microphone, you're welcome to come off mute and speak. Not seeing any coming in, so that must mean that it's all very clear and that we're dying to see these recommendations that were drafted in New York. So let's open those up, and as we do, I'm just going to reflect on some of the survey responses that come in that I think you're going to see reflected in these draft recommendations as well. I see themes of, I think number one is probably just recognizing the value of nature appropriately and making sure that there's mutual sort of respect and collaboration between the infrastructure and the transport communities. I see more awareness of solutions. I see a couple of comments around making sure that there's equity in access to all of the benefits that are provided by this infrastructure. That the necessity of natural infrastructure is recognized, that global policy platforms are adopting this challenge and integrating these things together, and that this is brought into national planning contexts and regional planning so that we're ending up with connected corridors. I think this is an amazing set of suggestions already, or future looking achievements that we can point to that I think really do reflect well what we talked about in New York a couple of weeks ago. So I'd like to share the recommendations now. Can we pull up those slides, please? Thank you very much. Okay, so these recommendations, as we mentioned, they were drafted in this hybrid side event that occurred at the high-level political forum in New York 2 weeks ago. They're set on these two questions, one focused on how to accelerate progress towards 2030 and one on what the post-2030 framework needs to look like. And as the speakers have reiterated, these are, about their processes too. These are a draft. They're not finished. They're not prescriptive. We've designed this process to build on the high-level political forums conversation and these recommendations. So please feel free to poke holes, add things. What are we missing? What questions do these raise? But I'll just start by going through them really quickly. To accelerate progress towards 2030, our conversation agreed that we need to require early integration of biodiversity screening and infrastructure planning, because the earlier you can make these decisions, the fewer impacts you have to mitigate and the better outcomes you can achieve. We need to establish interministerial coordination mechanisms with specific mandate and monitoring framework, because it's not just the ministries of transport or environment who are responsible for these outcomes. The ministries of finance, public works, energy, tourism, et cetera, all have a role to play as well. We need to make the economic case for nature positive design using life cycle cost analysis and other cost impacts, which Alice, you laid out very nicely in your last presentation. We need to address the timing and incentive mismatch as well in infrastructure financing, because the costs and the risks of building with nature and using nature-based solutions don't always match up with those who benefit from the operational resilience and the sustainability down the lifespan of the asset. We need to look at embedding biodiversity requirements into MDB lending criteria, national procurement framework, so that every decision is made with nature in mind throughout the infrastructure development process. And we need to invest in mapping ecosystem services in critical biodiversity areas and understanding them as shared planning infrastructure. And then looking at post-2030 framework design. Next slide, please. The first one, as Carly has laid out, we need to consolidate rather than create new targets. There are a lot of targets and metrics out there. How can we use those to build joint reviews and look at this more holistically? There's also calls for standardizing the terminology, the metrics, and the protocols that we use across rating systems, financing frameworks, and national regulations to make sure that there's interoperability so we can compare and combine different standards or different financing conditions. We need to develop approaches that make biodiversity impacts legible and comparable without forcing false standardization. And this is in comparison to sort of how the carbon accounting takes place for emissions and embodied carbon. Biodiversity impacts are so place-based, it's non-fungible in that same way. And then we need to design the post-2030 framework to address existing and retrofitted infrastructure, not just new construction, because there are existing impacts that there are to deal with. And then we need to shift the unit of analysis from the project level to the system level in infrastructure planning and assessment, so that we're avoiding cumulative impacts at the landscape and regional scales. So strong set of recommendations. We'll send these out afterwards in the email, and they were just dropped into the chat. Thank you, Priscilla. So feel free to download these and open them up. And these are going to be the basis for our conversation for the next half hour. Please feel free to add new topics as well. If there's any gaps that you're seeing in these recommendations as they are, or if there are opportunities to strengthen them, that's more than welcome. If there's new goals that we need or recommendations that we need, that would be welcome as well. So I'm going to open up for a couple minutes of group discussion before we go into the breakout around these recommendations specifically. And looking at these two sets, is there something missing that what you have seen in your work needs to be reflected in these recommendations, or something in the recommendations that doesn't reflect what's happening on the ground or in your work? The floor is open to anybody in the community who would like to join. I see a couple of comments. Let me open up the chat.
Daniel, are you able to put the recommendations back up on the screen just so that we can have them up?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we can start with the accelerating progress towards 2030.
There's also a link to a PDF in the chat if anyone wants to click that and bring that up on their end.
Thanks.
Well, I'm reading Matthew's comments now about putting a price on the social value of integrating nature, the aesthetic value of greener journeys, better mental health. I think the tourism sector is somewhat thinking about this, but that's a place where we can certainly do more as well. The mental health costs for people involved in wildlife collisions, people that get distressed from seeing dead animals. Yeah, absolutely. I did a road trip earlier, or a couple of years ago, from the west coast of the United States to the east coast of the United States, and you can see not only how the landscape changes, but the roadkill changes as you move. Went from deers to hogs in the middle of the country, and then back to deer on the east coast. It was very strange. Let's see. Okay, and then Matthew's second comment. Maintenance is another big issue. Absolutely. Drainage, biodiversity solutions are seen as more expensive. Who's going to maintain it? Yeah, Matthew, I think this is a really good point. The people that benefit, this kind of goes back to that incentive mismatch, right? The people who are maintaining the systems know what it takes to maintain these green systems, which may or may not be beneficial, and the people who are designing it are not always the people who are maintaining it. Martijn, I see your comment. The biodiversity screening will be a challenge regarding planning, cost, and capacity. It will require more innovative ways to gather this data. Yeah, would you like to speak a little bit more to that and what challenges you've seen in gathering data?
Yeah, sure. Well, here in Suriname, there is very little capacity to do the biodiversity screening, and we're not used to doing it, especially governmental agencies. One minister already said, well, it will take too much time at the early stages of a project to take that into consideration. And yeah, it will raise the cost of a project. So those are the things that really are a challenge here. And I don't think that is limited to just Suriname. I think it is for the entire global south.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of developments right now. And I think AI can provide some solutions as well when we look into it. That might reduce the impacts on cost planning and lack of capacity. So I think that would be strong to develop those.
Absolutely. Great recommendation. I see Tremi's hand and then Alice's.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. And Martijn, thanks for the comment. I can also follow up with you since we're colleagues, but I just want to maybe ask in front of everyone, what form of support do you think would be most effective in Suriname? What ways can a community like this help solve that problem? There are definitely excellent examples in South America, particularly Colombia, of policy that really is integrating nature much better in infrastructure planning and demonstrating cost savings pretty clearly. How can we transmit that messaging to Surinamese government?
Yeah, I think sharing that information, not just with Suriname, but other countries as well, will be very beneficial. When you're talking about policies and so on, it doesn't really solve the issue of gathering data. And I think there are already good examples for that, and sharing those will kickstart it. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. I think we have some more discussion to have, Martijn.
Yeah, for sure.
Good things to follow up on. Alice, I saw your hand, and then Carly.
Thank you. I raised it manually and there's no button. But Martijn, thank you very much for your sharing. And actually, just towards your last point, I was like, that was exactly what I wanted to say is how AI actually could potentially kind of solve this issue between the time that is required and the upfront cost that is associated with these screening. And I'm actually not a biodiversity expert, unfortunately. But very recently, we have this discussion with another partner that actually deals with climate resilience mappings and tools and screening. And, I think they kind of share very similar restraints and barriers with nature. In the sense of what you were just sharing is that it's very hard to upstream the process, the screening, and because of the time that was required. And so there was actually a new tool that was developed by a colleague called Oris. And what happens is that they apply the AI component to the mapping of the routes that are black spots, and then, but there's also an element of aligning resilience interventions that are appropriate and proportional to the project budget. So there's like some more automated calculations that are involved in this platform in order to kind of align and help the decision-making process to finish it in much shorter time, which I thought was a very interesting idea to emerge. And I wonder, I'm really no expert to biodiversity, but perhaps, this idea could be further curated, is to see what is to really identify where are the time being spent, in these screening processes. And I know AI sometimes is a bit over the top or like, over exaggerated, but when we apply it to the right ways, and maybe it's really about encouraging startups, about, collaborating with the science community or with the AI community, and to develop these tools that could start with some pilot projects and potentially being able to scalable, just to think about the mapping and the alignment of interventions and to the project budget. But yeah, I don't have a particular, solution to this, but I just thought that, across the different outcomes that we're seeing, some people are using AI to kind of shorten the time for screening and assessment. But thanks a lot. I will keep looking at this to see if there's any other examples.
Amazing. Thank you, Alice. Over to you, Carly. And then we'll go to Kate, and then we're going to break out for a quick discussion in smaller groups.
Thanks. So I think the recommendations are great. I think the economic case, including the return on investment, should almost be the top recommendation, because I think what I'm realizing more and more is that it's the sort of economic development, the job prosperity, the savings, which all government departments are interested in. So you kind of need to lead with that before anything. So if there was a way to think about, who are the specific holders of the power, the decision making, the purse strings, and then frame the economic case for them individually, then that would be the starting point. And I think there's also then a sort of sub recommendation, which is what is the pathway to reach them? Like if Grid wants to influence and is coming up with a business case, how do you actually reach those decision makers? Like, how are you going to do that? I think the other recommendation is around mapping out the stakeholders that are enablers of reaching these decision makers. So IRF, Alice, for example, the International Union of Railways, UIC, they all have hundreds and thousands of members who are the ones who are building infrastructure, and they have their own guidance and toolkits and training programs. So how could Grid sort of unlock that sort of economy of scale of almost if you could get UIC to accept the business case for better integrating nature, or IRF, then they can reach their members. And then my last point was around also mapping out where the infrastructure investment and decisions on design is happening. So, for example, bank loans and project specifications is one of them. And I think it's there around the MDBs, like really targeted guidance for the MDBs on where they can hook this into their lending criteria. But then also often ministries of urban planning have huge mass public transport pipeline projects. So that's like another hook in. So those were my sort of 3 points on how to sort of accelerate the progress that these recommendations have set out. Thanks.
Yeah, really well said, Carly. Thank you. Kate.
I can't resist talking about the data issue. So we've moved on a bit about it, but this last point here, we're working on the question that Martijn is raising is fundamental to actually being able to deliver a lot of these recommendations. And there's something that the US has done, and I think the UK has something similar. We have some UK folks online, but we have a thing called ecological, which is buried deep within the US Highway Administration website. But the principle of it is that a community or a suite of an area, let's say, in this case, multiple counties within a state usually, take the time to establish their ecological priorities. And it's the cases I'm thinking of, they started with a not in my backyard issue. Nobody wants this or that near them. Well, what do they want? What do they want to maintain? And taking the time to have a very consultative process. And one of the cases, it was 4 years before they reinstated a permitting process to say, we want to keep these mountainsides green because it's a tourism attraction, and we need this freshwater system for serving our cities, and we need these things. And having those all established in a sort of area environmental base plan, then cut permitting time from a norm in the United States, because we have so many layers, from 15 years to 2 years, because many of those things that you would include, those steps in a biodiversity assessment, were already established and the priorities had already been agreed by all the levels of consultation. And having that base environmental plan can be achieved, as you guys are suggesting, with AI. And let me just say one more pitch, because I love to pitch this. In the Philippines, they have something called Hazard Hunter, geohazardhunter.ph, which is a multi-ministerial sharing of real-time data, that's spatial data on geological issues like landslides, volcanoes, and earthquakes, the seismic data and the precipitation data, and it's all based on a LiDAR map of the whole country, which allows immediate planning possibilities because you can identify risks and you can overlay then the assets you have on terms of biodiversity ecosystem services and already identify where you can and can't go super fast. So some of these tools are out there. It's just pulling them together and getting cooperation between the ministries that hold them and understanding that those ministries serve all the other ministries. It's a big step, but it's very doable, and there are really interesting examples out there to build on. Over.
Thank you very much, Kate. I'm going to give Tremi the last word in this group discussion, then we're going to go to a quick breakout.
And I'll be quick, Daniel, because I know that we want to get there. But I just want to say, for the cost benefit analysis point that a lot of people are making, which we hear so much of, and we all need to get on that, providing case studies and looking at really how it can be done well. And also, along with Martine's question, we recently, a couple of weeks ago, took a team from Colombia down to Bolivia, where they're overhauling policy on infrastructure. And I see we have a colleague from Bolivia here, which is exciting to see. And Colombia was able to share the example that I mentioned earlier. And we did one day of the workshop, and we received feedback in the meantime from the Ministry of Planning, and they said, can you talk more about the cost? That's what people want to see. And so the next day we had a whole presentation on the cost and showed a lot of examples of roads failing from bad planning, bad maintenance of verges, and it was really powerful. By the end of the day, people were saying this is a priority, and these are people from the roads and infrastructure sector. So those examples, and including visual examples, can be really powerful. But I think we need to really standardize them and put them into case studies and things. So that's my point for the moment.
Excellent. Thank you, Tremi. We are at time, so I'm going to close. Thank you so much to Elena, Carly, Alice for speaking and starting us off with this engaging conversation. Thank you to all the participants for joining and making this really interesting. I have a lot of other notes that I'll get cut off from, but please follow CoPNI on LinkedIn and feel free to join our webinar or our email list on the GRID website. There will be more webinars coming up that will be announced in those platforms, and then there will be, more of this process on the post 2030 agenda and how we can contribute towards aligning these goals. So lots more to come. We'll follow up with the draft recommendations revised based on the conversation today, and we will continue the conversation. Thank you all so much for joining us. Hope to talk to you soon.